America's new law on tax compliance, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, will take effect tomorrow, July 1st, and affect 1 million U.S. citizens living in Canada. Joining us to discuss the implications is lawyer John Richardson. Thank you very much for joining us. I understand you are an expat of America, so you're going to be caught up in this law. Is that correct?
Well, I'm a tax-compliant expat. I would
Look
say,
right into the camera when you say
I'm a tax-compliant expat. Yes, the implications of this are absolutely huge. I heard you say the figure of 1 million. That's the lowest estimate I've ever heard. But I would point out that many of these 1 million Canadians who also happen to be U.S. citizens have spouses who are Canadian only, family members, and the families are absolutely affected by this as well. So the true number affected by this may well be 3 times that, 3 million.
Understand that the U.S. is the only large economy that affects that it's their total global wealth or global earnings that are affected. What is the purpose of this particular law?
Well, it's absolutely extraordinary. The United States is the only major country that uses what they call citizenship-based taxation, but the reality is that that makes it sound as though it's sort of patriotic. The reality is that it's overwhelmingly simply place of birth taxation. So once born in the United States, the U.S. tax laws follow you around the world, regardless of any other citizenships that you may have, wherever you may live, on any income that you may make anywhere in the world. So essentially, and incredibly, the United States is the only country in the world that takes the position that it has the right to tax non-U.S. residents on income completely disconnected from the United States.
But this ability or this desire to tax their citizens anywhere in the world isn't new, is my understanding, but this law is new. So what took us from today to tomorrow?
Well, I think we need to go back before today. The laws taxing on the basis of citizenship actually have their origins in the Civil War, if one can imagine. But the reality is that although many U.S. citizens abroad have known of that, most haven't. Those who have known of that have been tax compliant. So essentially this isn't new, but it was never enforced, never been any advertising on it. But in 2009, the U.S. government essentially made the decision that they wanted to enhance reporting requirements in general. This had to do with tax evasion from people who live in the United States using Swiss banks, etc., and came out with this FATCA, Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act law, which was originally intended really just to catch the accounts of people living in the United States using foreign accounts, but they've now applied it to all U.S. persons abroad.
And so it's not just, there's a couple of implications. We'll talk about the individual, but there is financial reporting now required by Canadian banks, by global banks or global custodians. Tell us how that's going to work.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. Effective tomorrow, those banks who choose to comply with these U.S. laws, and the truth is that most of them are afraid to not comply.
Because otherwise they might be shut out of
the United States is using FATCA as a way to sanction countries that essentially do things they don't want, and it has extended beyond tax reporting. They've tried to do that with Russia, but the bottom line is simply this, that in order to avoid a 30% deduction, and it's not a withholding, it's a straight deduction from money going to, say, the Toronto Dominion Bank from the United States, they have to agree to first, at their own expense, identify anybody who the U.S. essentially decides to define as a U.S. person. And incidentally, that definition can, and I would imagine will, change over time. And then once identified...
Right now, is it as simple as birth?
No, most of the people would be birth, but there are people who are naturalized in the United States. It would also include people who spend too much time there, more than approximately 180 days, subject to a complicated test. But mainly it's place of birth taxation. And, so you have all these people, for example, who, in New Brunswick, many people born in Maine. Why? Closest hospital, plain and simple, very porous border. And now they're finding, oh my God, I'm supposed to be paying U.S. taxes, and it's a very, very real fear.
In that particular instance, relinquishing your American citizenship, is that easy to do if you happen to be born in Maine?
Very, very difficult to do. Very difficult to do. The issue of the relinquishment, which could include renunciation, is handled on the level of the State Department. But for people relinquishing in present-day time, the U.S. laws are written so that they still qualify as a citizen for tax purposes, even though they're really not a citizen. So it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, one more example of the United States taking the position that they have the right to tax people who are not even U.S. citizens outside the United States.
So you can't get away from Uncle Sam. What is the financial burden for, just kind of generally speaking, for the financial institutions who have to accelerate this kind of reporting?
Well, I've heard all kinds of things, and of course I'm not privy to that information, but in the same way we hear many times 1 million Americans in Canada, I've heard $100 million for the Toronto-Dominion Bank to comply. Is that true? I don't know, but whatever the costs are, they're clearly significant, they're clearly substantial, and they clearly will ultimately be borne by the shareholders of those banks.
And what happens if somebody just woke up and maybe watching this program and said, you know, I am a U.S. citizen, I didn't kind of know, I've got to start reporting. Is there any penalties for not having done it in the past?
Well, according to the way the law is written, not only are there penalties, but they are penalties that could theoretically bankrupt you. Now, I say theoretically, I wouldn't want listeners to go into a panic and think they're going to be bankrupted by penalties. The simple fact of the matter is that most people do not know about this, and there are reasonable cause arguments. In addition to that, 2 weeks ago, the Internal Revenue Service issued a bulletin saying basically, Americans abroad, please come in. As long as you certify that you didn't know what the law was, etc., there will be no penalties. However, there may very well be significant taxes owing, because there are huge differences in the way U.S. tax laws and Canadian tax laws. For example, tax-free capital gain on your house in Canada, not so in the United States. That's one of many. So those who are affected by this, I think, probably should get some counseling before they do too much too fast.
FATCA on Canada Day tomorrow comes into effect. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
John Richardson is a lawyer.